Brutal crash between Lewis Hamilton's car and Charles Leclerc's during the Bahrain tests. Stay until the end to see the possible penalties proposed by the FIA. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The world of Formula One has just witnessed one of the most shocking, chaotic, and unprecedented incidents in recent preseason testing history. An event so dramatic that it has sent shockwaves through the entire paddock and left fans, analysts, and team personnel reeling in disbelief. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, two of the sport's biggest icons, two of the most respected and experienced drivers on the grid, have just collided. And this was no mere scrape, no minor misjudgment leading to a harmless tap. This was a full-scale, high-speed preseason testing disaster, the kind of accident that defies logic, rewrites expectations, and immediately becomes an entry in the history books of testing day calamities. The crash, which unfolded under the relentless Bahraini sun on the Sakhir International Circuit, has left garages in turmoil, engineers in crisis mode, and team principals scrambling to manage the fallout. Tempers have flared, accusations have begun flying between Ferrari and Mercedes, and the immediate aftermath of the collision is nothing short of absolute pandemonium. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The stage had been set long before the moment of impact. The tension between the two drivers and their respective teams had been simmering all morning, as both Mercedes and Ferrari arrived at the final test session determined to assert their dominance and lay down an early marker ahead of the new season. Leclerc, eager to prove that Ferrari's SF24 is finally capable of mounting a sustained title challenge, had been pushing the limits from the moment the session began. His aggressive approach was evident in his lap times. Sector after sector, the Monegasque was shaving off fractions of a second, extracting every ounce of performance from his machine. On the other side of the garage, Hamilton was engaged in an equally intense mission. Mercedes, after 2 seasons of struggling to reclaim their former glory, had arrived in Bahrain with an aggressive new approach, determined to show that the W15 was a different beast altogether. The 7-time world champion was visibly dialed in, methodically testing different aerodynamic configurations, pushing the car on long-run simulations, and demonstrating a level of commitment that suggested he was unwilling to settle for anything less than title contention. From the outside, it seemed inevitable that the paths of these two titans would eventually cross on track. What nobody could have predicted, however, was that their long-standing respect for each other, built over years of clean, hard-fought battles, would come to a dramatic halt in such a catastrophic fashion. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The incident unfolded in a split second, but its consequences will be felt for weeks, if not months, to come. Reports from trackside witnesses suggest that both drivers had been running near identical lap times in the lead-up to the crash. Leclerc, in the midst of a long-run simulation, was navigating the high-speed sequence of turns 9 and 10 when Hamilton, who had just completed an adjustment in the pits and switched to fresh soft tires, emerged from the garage and began his push lap. The timing of their encounter was nothing short of disastrous. Leclerc, approaching turn 11 at blistering speed, was committed to his racing line, focused on executing another clean lap. Hamilton, now accelerating on a flying lap with fresh rubber, was also fully committed, looking to exploit the new grip levels and gauge how the W15 responded in optimal conditions. It was a recipe for disaster. With the blind nature of turn 11 limiting visibility, neither driver seemed fully aware of the other's approach until it was too late. The onboard telemetry suggests that as Leclerc exited turn 10 and prepared to sweep into the left-hander, Hamilton, traveling at a slightly higher speed due to his fresher tires, closed the gap at an alarming rate. The Ferrari driver, expecting to hold his line without challenge, found himself suddenly facing an unexpected rival at precisely the wrong moment. Hamilton, on the other hand, either miscalculated the closing speed or assumed Leclerc would back off. The collision was violent, brutal, and entirely avoidable. The two cars made contact in a sickening crunch of carbon fiber and titanium, the front right of Hamilton's Mercedes colliding with the rear left of Leclerc's Ferrari. The sheer force of the impact sent both cars into an uncontrollable slide, with Leclerc's SF24 suffering a sharp snap over steer and slamming sideways into the barriers at high speed. Hamilton, meanwhile, fought desperately to regain control but was ultimately unable to prevent his W15 from careening into the gravel trap, where it eventually came to a dramatic halt. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. In the immediate aftermath, the silence on team radios was deafening. The Mercedes pit wall, initially frozen in shock, scrambled to make contact with Hamilton, while Ferrari's garage erupted in a mix of horror and fury. Track marshals rushed to the scene, red flags were instantly waved, and both cars sat motionless in the aftermath of what had just transpired. When the dust settled, the damage assessment was severe. Leclerc's Ferrari had sustained extensive damage, with the rear suspension completely destroyed and significant side pod and floor damage rendering the car undrivable. The impact had also shredded parts of the rear wing, with debris scattered across the track. Hamilton's W15, while not as catastrophically damaged, had still suffered significant front wing destruction, side pod crumpling, and potential suspension misalignment. Both teams immediately began evaluating the extent of the damage, but the prospects of either car returning to the track before the end of the session seemed bleak. The paddock reaction was immediate and visceral. Ferrari team principal Frédéric Vasseur was visibly livid, seen in heated discussions with FIA officials as he demanded answers regarding Hamilton's actions. Meanwhile, Mercedes boss Toto Wolff maintained a composed but visibly frustrated demeanor, suggesting that his team viewed the incident as a miscommunication rather than outright recklessness. Social media exploded within minutes, with fans and analysts dissecting every available camera angle, telemetry readout, and radio message to piece together exactly who was at fault. Post-incident interviews provided contrasting perspectives. Leclerc, still visibly shaken but composed, described the crash as incredibly unfortunate, but subtly hinted at frustration, stating, "I was fully committed to my lap. I didn't expect anyone to challenge the line at that point. It's not what we needed in testing." Hamilton, on the other hand, adopted a diplomatic tone, acknowledging the severity of the crash but refraining from pointing fingers. "These things happen, it's testing, we're all pushing. I'm just glad we're both okay." The implications of this crash stretch far beyond the immediate damage to the cars. Both teams now face unexpected setbacks in their testing programs, with valuable track time lost and crucial data left uncollected. Ferrari, in particular, may struggle to recover, given that replacement parts for the SF24 were already limited due to the tight preseason development schedule. For Mercedes, while the damage is less severe, the psychological blow of losing valuable momentum could prove costly. As the sun sets over the Bahrain International Circuit, one thing is certain: this is not just another testing day headline. This is a moment that will be dissected, debated, and remembered for years to come. With tensions now at an all-time high and a new chapter added to the long-standing Ferrari-Mercedes rivalry, all eyes will be on the first race of the season, where the potential for further fireworks has just skyrocketed. The battle lines have been drawn. Formula One in 2025 has officially begun in the most dramatic fashion possible. It all unfolded in the final sector of the circuit, an area of the track where commitment is paramount, where a driver's confidence in their car's stability and braking performance can make the difference between a clean lap and a disastrous miscalculation. Lewis Hamilton, in the midst of a high-fuel stint, was focused on gathering long-run data, methodically testing Mercedes' race pace and tire degradation over extended runs. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc, on a significantly lighter fuel load, was attacking the lap with maximum aggression, pushing the SF24 to its absolute limits as Ferrari chased crucial one-lap performance data. With the two drivers on vastly different run plans, the potential for misjudgment was high, but few could have anticipated the sheer chaos that was about to unfold. As they approached turn 11, a sweeping left-hander that requires absolute commitment, razor-sharp precision, and millimeter-perfect positioning, Leclerc, desperate to clear Hamilton before the tight, technical final sector, made a split-second decision to dive down the inside. Whether it was an instinctive move, a desperate bid to avoid losing time, or simply a misjudgment remains a matter of debate, but what happened next sent shockwaves through the paddock. Leclerc, carrying significantly more speed into the corner than Hamilton, miscalculated his braking point by a fraction of a second, a tiny error, but in Formula One, tiny errors have enormous consequences. The front left tire of the Ferrari locked up almost instantly, generating an unmistakable screech as rubber met asphalt in a futile attempt to slow the car down in time. The SF24, now essentially a passenger in its own trajectory, speared violently into the side of Hamilton's W15 with terrifying force. The brutal impact sent both cars flying off the track in an explosion of carbon fiber, dust, and debris, a chaotic and destructive ballet unfolding at blistering speed. The sound was deafening, the unmistakable crunch of carbon fiber shattering, the screeching of tires desperately trying to grip the asphalt, and the deep, echoing thud as two of Formula One's top contenders were unceremoniously ejected from the racing line into the gravel runoff. A cloud of dust engulfed the scene, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Hamilton's W15 had suffered catastrophic damage. The side pod on the right side had been completely obliterated, exposing delicate internal components to the elements. The floor, one of the most crucial aerodynamic elements of modern F1 cars, had been shredded beyond repair, its intricate carbon fiber structure rendered useless in an instant. But the most alarming consequence for Mercedes came when the engineers inspected the chassis. The force of Leclerc's impact had been so severe that the structural integrity of the monocoque was compromised. In testing conditions, this is an absolute disaster. Chassis damage of this magnitude meant that the team had no choice but to conduct a full replacement, an emergency overnight rebuild that would consume countless hours, forcing mechanics to work through the night just to get the car back on track for the next session. The timing could not have been worse. Pre-season testing is an invaluable opportunity for teams to collect data, trial new aerodynamic components, and refine setup configurations before the first race of the season. Losing precious track time due to an incident of this scale was a nightmare scenario for Mercedes, and with only a limited number of spare parts available in testing, the logistical headache of rebuilding the car under such circumstances only compounded their frustration. Every lap lost meant valuable performance insight slipping away, an unquantifiable setback in an environment where every millisecond of data matters. Ferrari's situation was not much better. The SF24, once a finely tuned machine in the midst of a crucial data-gathering session, was now a wreckage of broken components and shattered expectations. The front wing had been obliterated upon impact, its intricate aerodynamic elements strewn across the runoff area like discarded puzzle pieces. The front right suspension, unable to withstand the sheer force of the collision, had snapped like a brittle twig, leaving the car inoperable before it even came to a stop. Ferrari engineers, who had been monitoring telemetry data in real time from the garage, were left stunned as the numbers on their screens flatlined. Their session was over in an instant. Beyond the physical damage, the ramifications of the incident extended far deeper. Testing programs are meticulously planned down to the smallest detail, with every minute on track accounted for. The loss of an entire session, especially one in which crucial aerodynamic correlation work was being conducted, was a massive setback for Ferrari. Engineers rely on continuous, uninterrupted runs to evaluate new parts, measure tire degradation, and validate wind tunnel simulations against real-world data. With the SF24 stranded in the gravel, those opportunities had evaporated, leaving the team scrambling to reassess their approach for the remaining test days. In the paddock, the fallout was immediate. Both teams, already under intense scrutiny as they prepared for a season where every advantage could be the difference between victory and defeat, found themselves at the center of an unexpected controversy. The stewards launched an immediate review of the incident, analyzing telemetry data, onboard footage, and radio communications to determine whether Leclerc's move had been a reckless misjudgment or an unavoidable racing incident. Reactions from rival teams were mixed. Some saw it as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of pushing the limits during testing. After all, drivers are constantly balancing risk versus reward, and in such high-pressure environments, mistakes are bound to happen. Others, however, viewed Leclerc's move as unnecessarily aggressive, questioning whether such a high-risk maneuver was warranted in a non-competitive session where data collection should take precedence over on-track battles. Hamilton, ever the composed veteran, exited his wrecked W15 and made his way back to the paddock, his expression unreadable. Whether frustration, disappointment, or simple acceptance, his body language gave little away. Leclerc, on the other hand, remained in his cockpit for a moment longer, staring blankly at the steering wheel before finally unclipping his harness and stepping out into the harsh sunlight. Both men knew that testing incidents happen, but the sheer scale of the destruction left a lingering tension in the air. As night fell over the circuit, mechanics from both teams worked tirelessly under the artificial glow of garage lights, racing against the clock to piece together what remained of their battered machines. For Mercedes, the priority was getting the replacement chassis assembled, ensuring that every component was recalibrated and optimized to match the performance characteristics of the original car. For Ferrari, it was about salvaging whatever data they could from the wreckage, assessing whether any of their planned development paths needed to be altered in light of the lost running time. By the next morning, both teams had managed the impossible. Both cars were back on track, rebuilt and ready to resume their testing programs. The incident, while costly, was now a part of history, another chapter in the unpredictable drama of Formula One. Yet, the echoes of that clash in Turn 11 lingered. Questions remained. Had Ferrari's aggressive approach cost them more than they gained? Would Mercedes, already facing performance concerns, be able to recover from such a devastating setback? And perhaps most importantly, would this moment of preseason chaos foreshadow an even fiercer battle between these two teams once the real racing began? As the engines roared back to life, the paddock was left with only one certainty. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a thrilling and unpredictable season. The moment was electric, a boiling point of raw emotion and high-stakes drama unfolding before the stunned eyes of the paddock. Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion and one of the most composed figures on the grid, had reached his breaking point. The collision itself had been shocking, a completely unnecessary accident in what was supposed to be a routine preseason test session. But what happened next would be replayed, analyzed, and dissected endlessly by fans and pundits alike. As the dust settled and the smoke from the shredded Pirellis lingered in the warm Bahrain air, Hamilton, still strapped into the battered remains of his Mercedes, could be seen gripping the sides of his cockpit, his breathing heavy, his expression hidden beneath the dark visor of his helmet. The radio was silent. His race engineer, Peter Bonington, knew better than to say anything in that moment. The silence lasted only a second before Hamilton ripped off his steering wheel with a sharp, almost violent motion, unbuckled his harness, and launched himself out of the wreckage. With a speed and purpose that belied the fact that this was just a testing session, Hamilton stormed down the pit lane, his black and silver race suit still covered in dust and debris from the crash. Every camera in the paddock honed in on him, broadcasters scrambling to capture every detail of what was about to happen. The tension in the air was palpable. Team members stood frozen in their garages, engineers paused mid-discussion, and pit crews exchanged glances. Everyone knew this was about to explode. As he reached the Ferrari garage, Hamilton's piercing eyes locked onto his target, Charles Leclerc, who had just emerged from his own damaged SF-24, his posture stiff with tension. Leclerc knew what was coming. His crash helmet was still on, but the telltale signs of anxiety were visible in his body language. He took a half step forward, as if to explain himself, but Hamilton was already there, closing the gap between them with an intensity that sent a shockwave through the entire Ferrari team. What the hell was that? Hamilton's voice cut through the murmurs and background noise of the paddock like a knife. Are you kidding me, Charles? You dive-bomb me like it's the last lap of a Grand Prix in Abu Dhabi? This is testing. What are you even thinking? The words hit Leclerc like a slap. His hands instinctively went up, a defensive gesture as he tried to make sense of the moment. I thought you were letting me through, he stammered, still catching his breath. I had the inside line. I didn't mean. Hamilton wasn't having it. He took a step closer, voice laced with sheer disbelief. Letting you through? On a cool-down lap? Do you even know what you just did? You've wrecked my car. You understand how much time we just lost? How much data we needed today? You don't do this in testing, man. You just don't. The Ferrari crew, sensing the brewing storm, began to shift nervously around their driver, forming an instinctive barrier between Leclerc and Hamilton. Team principal Frédéric Vasseur emerged from the back of the garage, his expression unreadable but his presence alone an indication that Ferrari wanted to de-escalate the situation. Leclerc, still visibly shaken, tried again. Lewis, I swear I didn't mean to hit you, he said, his voice lower but urgent. I thought you saw me coming. The gap was there. I committed. The gap was there. Hamilton let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't just assume someone is going to jump out of the way in testing. That's not how this works. We're collecting data, working through programs, not sending it into turn one like it's Monaco quali. Around them, the paddock was deathly silent. Even rival teams had stopped what they were doing, engineers watching from their monitors, mechanics pausing mid-task. Social media was already exploding. Clips of the crash and Hamilton's furious march to the Ferrari garage were flooding Twitter, Instagram, and every F1 forum imaginable. In the Mercedes garage, Toto Wolff's jaw was set tight, his fingers steepled as he watched the live footage on the team's monitors. Standing beside him, Mercedes technical director James Allison exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. The situation was a disaster. Leclerc, realizing the conversation was only escalating, shook his head. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I messed up. It was a misjudgment. Hamilton exhaled sharply, his jaw still clenched. Damn right it was, he muttered. But the sheer anger in his body language was beginning to fade. He had said what he needed to say. The Ferrari mechanics took that as their cue, subtly guiding Leclerc back towards the garage as Vasseur exchanged a tense nod with Hamilton, as if to say, "We'll deal with this later." Hamilton turned away, still simmering but now clearly trying to rein it in. He knew there was no fixing what had just happened. His day was over, his car in pieces, and whatever data Mercedes had been hoping to collect was now useless. As he made his way back toward the Mercedes garage, his race suit still streaked with dirt, the cameras followed his every step. The moment was far from over. The questions, the headlines, the fallout, it was all still to come. And one thing was certain, when Hamilton and Leclerc next found themselves wheel to wheel, it wouldn't just be another battle. It would be personal. The tension in the Ferrari garage reached a suffocating peak. A place normally filled with the steady hum of engineers analyzing telemetry, the occasional burst of laughter from mechanics, and the rhythmic sound of tire guns had now fallen into an eerie, almost terrifying silence. Every pair of eyes was locked on the unfolding confrontation, the energy so thick it was almost tangible. Even the live feed operators, normally focused on technical data, had shifted their cameras toward the two drivers, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Mercedes and Ferrari engineers stood frozen, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. No one had expected a routine pre-season testing session to descend into a full-fledged standoff between two of the sport's biggest names. The mechanics, usually quick to react in high-pressure situations, hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure if they should step in or wait for their respective team principals to handle the situation. That split-second pause was enough for Lewis Hamilton to continue, his voice sharp, cutting through the paddock like a blade. "You know what?" Hamilton said, his tone laced with both anger and incredulity as he shook his head. "You just proved it. You're reckless. I've raced Max, I've raced Alonso, I've raced the best, and none of them have ever pulled something like this in testing." His words carried weight. They weren't just an accusation, they were a damning verdict. Testing was supposed to be controlled, professional, a time to gather data, not to throw wild on-track moves as if it were the final laps of a Grand Prix. And yet, Charles Leclerc had, in Hamilton's eyes, crossed a line that should never have been approached in the first place. Leclerc's face, initially a mix of mild frustration and defensiveness, morphed into something more intense. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffened. He had always been a composed driver, known for his passionate yet level-headed approach to racing. But Hamilton's words had struck a nerve. The insinuation that he was reckless, that he had committed a cardinal sin among professional drivers, was an accusation he wasn't going to let slide. "Oh, come on, Lewis." Leclerc snapped, his voice rising in pitch as his frustration bubbled over. "You act like I did it on purpose. Maybe if you weren't sitting in the middle of the track doing nothing, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." A collective gasp rippled through the paddock. Had Leclerc just called out Hamilton for being in the way? The murmurs grew louder, whispers spreading like wildfire among journalists, mechanics, and even rival teams watching the situation unfold. This wasn't just a heated exchange. This was turning into an all-out war. Toto Wolff, who had sprinted over the moment he saw the confrontation escalating, momentarily hesitated. He had seen Hamilton fired up before. He had witnessed him go head-to-head with Verstappen, duel with Rosberg, even challenge FIA decisions with unshakable conviction. But this felt different. There was a rawness to it, an edge that suggested this wasn't just about an on-track incident. It was personal. Frédéric Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, had also arrived at the scene, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with plenty of inter-team drama before, but a public altercation between two of the biggest names in the sport, at testing no less, was an entirely different beast. His eyes darted between Hamilton and Leclerc, assessing, calculating. The political ramifications of this argument were as dangerous as the sporting ones. By now, Mercedes and Ferrari mechanics had snapped into action, instinctively trying to separate the two drivers before things escalated beyond words. The paddock atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had started as a simple testing session had now transformed into the biggest talking point of the day, perhaps even the entire preseason. Cameras were rolling, journalists were scrambling to get statements, and social media was already buzzing. For the spectators watching, this wasn't just another disagreement between two competitive drivers. This was a clash between two generations, two philosophies of racing. Hamilton, the battle-hardened veteran, a seven-time world champion who had seen it all, who had fought on the front lines of F1 for over a decade, refusing to accept what he saw as an unacceptable breach of professionalism. And Leclerc, the younger star, fiery, talented, desperate to cement his place as the next great champion, unwilling to back down even in the face of one of the sport's all-time legends. Wolff finally stepped in, placing a firm hand on Hamilton's shoulder, speaking in a measured yet urgent tone. "Lewis, let's take a breath. This isn't the time. We'll talk in the garage." Hamilton didn't move. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't done. Not yet. Vasseur, mirroring Wolff's approach, turned to Leclerc. "Charles, leave it. Let's handle this internally." Leclerc exhaled sharply, his frustration still simmering just beneath the surface. He shot Hamilton a final glare before taking a step back, his body language still defiant but restrained. The moment was defused, but the damage had already been done. In the aftermath, the paddock was abuzz with speculation. Would this confrontation spill over into the season? Was this the beginning of a deep-rooted rivalry? Had Ferrari and Mercedes just reignited a conflict that had lain dormant since the peak of the Hamilton-Vettel battles? One thing was certain: this was far from over. The immediate fallout was nothing short of dramatic. Mercedes, left with no alternative, had to withdraw from the remainder of the day's running, their mechanics already deep into the painstaking process of disassembling the wrecked chassis and preparing its replacement. This was no minor setback. The installation of a new chassis required an extensive teardown and rebuild, with every component from the suspension to the electronics needing to be meticulously refitted and recalibrated. It wasn't just about slapping on a new monocoque and sending the car back out. Every millimeter had to be perfect, every connection seamless, and every system rechecked before the W16 could turn another lap. What should have been a day of fine-tuning race pace and setup strategies had instead turned into a frantic salvage operation, with a team that prided itself on precision and perfection now racing against the clock just to get back on track for the following day. At Ferrari, the situation was just as frantic, though the Scuderia had one advantage. Leclerc's SF25, though battered, was at least salvageable. The front left suspension was in pieces, the front wing completely detached, and the side pod area had taken substantial damage. The garage floor was littered with broken carbon fiber, sensors dangling from the wreckage like exposed nerves. The team knew that every minute spent repairing the car was a minute lost in crucial data gathering. Unlike Mercedes, which had the unenviable task of rebuilding from the ground up, Ferrari's priority was to patch up the damage as quickly as possible and get Leclerc back out before the day ended. As the team scrambled to contain the chaos, the FIA wasted no time in launching a formal review of the incident. Within minutes, stewards were analyzing onboard footage, telemetry data, and radio transmissions, attempting to piece together exactly what had happened in those fateful seconds leading up to the crash. Was this simply an unfortunate misunderstanding, a racing incident in a session where the usual rules of engagement are more relaxed? Or had it been something more? The whispers circulating in the paddock suggested that both teams were preparing for potential ramifications. Would penalties be handed out? Could Leclerc be docked points before the season even began? Would Mercedes or Ferrari be summoned to explain their drivers' behavior? Nobody knew for certain, but what was clear was that this wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. The tension in the air was palpable, as reporters, rival teams, and even the FIA itself seemed to recognize that this was more than just a crash. This was the first flashpoint in what could be a season-defining rivalry. Meanwhile, within the Ferrari camp, Leclerc remained locked away in debriefs, reviewing data with his engineers while his mechanics worked at a blistering pace to get his car back in one piece. His radio communication just before the crash had been revealing: anger, frustration, and a sense that he had been forced into an uncompromising position. Did that frustration boil over into a rash move? Had he felt the need to assert himself against Hamilton in a way that would make it clear he wasn't going to back down this season? Hamilton, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. The seven-time world champion had left the paddock immediately after his media duties, avoiding any prolonged interactions with the press. His brief remarks after the incident were laced with unmistakable frustration, calling the crash completely unnecessary, and hinting at a lack of respect between drivers in testing. Those who knew Hamilton well understood that this wasn't just anger about losing track time. This was something deeper. This was about pride, about respect, about an unspoken hierarchy within the sport that had just been publicly challenged. Back in the Mercedes garage, Toto Wolff looked anything but pleased. The Austrian team principal, usually composed even in moments of crisis, had been seen pacing between engineers, speaking in hushed but intense tones. He knew what was at stake. Every lost lap meant lost data, and in a season where even the smallest margins could make the difference between title contention and disappointment, a day spent rebuilding a car instead of refining it was a bitter pill to swallow. More than that, this incident had the potential to create lasting animosity, not just between drivers, but between two of the most politically powerful teams in the sport. If relations between Ferrari and Mercedes had been cold before, they were now on the verge of becoming outright hostile. As the sun dipped below the Bahrain horizon, the paddock remained alive with speculation. This was more than just a crash. It was a statement, intentional or not. Leclerc had shown that he would not yield, that he would not bow to the established hierarchy, that he was prepared to go wheel to wheel with one of the most decorated drivers in history. Had this been a moment of reckless aggression, or was it the spark that ignited a season-long war for supremacy? The journalists gathered outside the garages were already spinning their narratives. Was this the birth of a new bitter rivalry? Would this be the defining battle of the 2025 season? And more importantly, how would Mercedes respond? Would they strike back on track, or would they take their grievances to the FIA? Meanwhile, in the control rooms of Formula One's broadcasting teams, editors were already stitching together dramatic slow-motion replays, preparing for a season launch that now had an unexpected and explosive subplot. The drama had been delivered before a single race had even been run. The battle lines had been drawn. The intensity had been set. And for fans watching around the world, one thing was clear: this was not going to be just another Formula One season. This was going to be a war.